Welcome, everybody. I am so excited to welcome everyone to this session on sonification. So delighted to welcome you on behalf of arXiv. My name is Shamsi Bryn. I work at arXiv, and I've had the pleasure of planning the accessibility forum and of working with this wonderful group of panelists. And before I hand it over to our fearless moderator, Kate, I just wanted to share a couple of notes about some accessibility accommodations. The first one is that you might notice the chat is off, and that is because Zoom chat is very disruptive for screen reader users. So we'll be using it very sparingly to share some links in the beginning, and then it should stay quiet during the rest of the meeting. A second thing I wanted to share is we want to give a little time now for any deaf participants to find and pin the ASL interpreters. There are two during this call. And last, I wanted to share that we're just going to share a couple of links in the chat to some resources. And one of those resources is we have some volunteers who are taking notes in the background. And this is just an open Google Doc that anybody can come and check as a reference if you had to run off to grab your popcorn and came back and wanted to catch up. We do have some wonderful volunteers in the background who are taking notes, and we'll be sharing that in the chat shortly. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Kate. I'm so excited.
Thanks, Shamsi. Hi, I'm Kate Meredith, and I am the Director of Education and President and Founder of GLAS Education, that's G-L-A-S, one S, Education in Wisconsin. And my organization grew out of the closing of the historic Yerkes Observatory nearby here in 2018. And since that time, we have become primarily an organization that works in the area of disability advocacy and work to provide greater access for people with disabilities to STEM education, outreach, and careers. And so this is really exciting work. I ended up getting into the area of sonification through the back door. I don't code, I don't create sonifications, and I'm not the least bit musical. But what I do is, as I say, I am the sonification den mother. I get people together to talk about how to create very accessible sonifications that are both perceivable, interpretable, and usable by everybody, no matter what your ability or disability is. And so as the sonification den mother, I get everybody together, and then I make sure that nobody's being left out. So that's my role, and that's why I'm really excited to be moderating this panel. And I don't think I've ever put this much time into getting ready for a panel. There's so much to tell you. So if you come out of this and you don't have everything in your head, just know that there are tons of resources, and these are just a few of the people who are out there waiting to support you in creating and using and giving input into this exciting area. So one of the things that we're not going to try and cover here is we're not going to be covering all of the ways that sound are used. So we're going to explore the landscape of sonification as a tool for exploring large data sets. And this is different than listening to actual sounds or interpreting them or using sound icons like you would in a hospital or alarms or things like that. We're looking at ways to be able to interpret large data sets. And that takes on educational components and all sorts of areas, but we're not going to try and do everything. And there's really an exciting area of using music and sonifications and doing artistic interpretations, but that will have to be saved for another project. So what we're going to do today is we are going to have a few people introduce themselves, and tell you about their sonifications. We'll have those folks talk. It's going to be Leif, Phia, Robin, Scott, and Sarah. And then we're going to have time for questions. And we're going to have a little pause in there. And then I'm going to check out all of your questions in the chat or in the Q&A. And then we'll come back together and we'll have a little bit more of an open discussion about this area. So with that, I am going to set my timer because I will be watching that carefully. And Leif is going to be our first speaker. And most of these folks I've met over the last 4 years as part of the work with the Sonification World Chat. And Leif is also going to be an advisor on a brand new National Science Foundation proposal to promote sonifications in the area of the geosciences. So with that, Leif, you are up first.
Okay, I just unmuted. Hopefully you can hear me all right. My name is Leif Karlstrom. I am a professor in the Department of Earth Sciences at the University of Oregon. I work on a lot of things, but mostly it has to do with volcanoes. My research is all about the processes that drive magma from deep in the Earth to the surface and the atmosphere and its impact on the surface environment. So I come at sonification from a research standpoint. I should say that I am also a musician, and so I wear that hat sometimes as well, and it deeply informs how I make choices about sonification. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to talk about the research side. And volcanology represents some interesting challenges for sonification because the types of data that we're interested in span all kinds of stuff. We have time series, we have event data, we have geographic, spatial data that we need to think about, right? And so the techniques that one uses to sonify the data vary quite a lot. And as a result, we've found that the existing tools that one might find, say on the internet, or various hardware that has been developed, doesn't always cut it. And so our efforts, which I've sort of broadly defined as the Volcano Listening Project. We have a website, volcanolisteningproject.org, if you want more information on that. But we develop algorithms and we also develop products. We're interested in how can we use sonification to learn something about our data sets, particularly multi-modal time series that represent different parts of the volcano that we don't really understand. So we're looking for identifying patterns, we're looking for expressing different types of diverse data concurrently. And so I'm going to give you, I guess, a very brief example of this as part of the materials that I submitted to this event. There's quite a long video. It's about 10 minutes. That's a lot longer than I have to talk about. But I'm going to highlight a couple of parts of this movie, which has to do with Kilauea volcano in Hawaii, which is a subject of my research for many years now. And we're interested in exploring how data collected by the Hawaii Volcano Observatory, a U.S. Geological Survey organization, informs the evolution of the volcano. So I'm going to highlight seismic data here, and then I'll sort of, at the very end, put it all together. So if you could play the video. Great. So what you're going to hear here are representations of seismic data that were collected near the volcano. We have a visual representation as well, which is both looking at the map view and the sort of idealized cross-section. The sound, if you could just play it.
Very long period seismic signals record oscillations of magma in the conduit and shallow reservoir. Frequencies of resonant oscillations are mapped to pitches whose decay rates correspond to how long each resonator rings. The frequencies and decay rates are sensitive to temperature and bubble content of magma in the conduit. Each seismic event records an excitation of resonant wave motion in the magma column, which acts somewhat like an organ pipe. Many events in sequence sound like this. Earthquakes reflect stress changes inside the volcano. We speed up the raw seismic data until it can be heard, panning left and right to reflect location of the event relative to the center of Halemaumau crater, like this.
Okay, great. So that's a demonstration of two different ways that we're sonifying seismic data. And so we put that together with sonification of another data set, which I'm not going to talk about, which is detailed in the full video, to represent activity over a long time period. This is a movie that represents actually about 10 years of activity at Kilauea. And so I'm just going to play you the finale so you get a sense of the whole thing. There are visual elements, right, that are tracking the sonified data as well. And again, more information on that is in the video. So if you just play this, and that'll be the end of my presentation. Great. So yeah, lots more to talk about here, and I'm happy to answer questions. We have the tools are freely available. They're written in Python, and I'm always happy to talk about sonification. So I'll end it there.
Thanks, Leif. I'm going to just ask you one quick question here. You did say that you created this in Python, and it's really obvious that your musical expertise has come through in the listenability of this. And when you do it with headphones, it's fantastic. But can you describe to me a little how you brought those two together, those two areas, and the technical pieces and the musical pieces?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess the most important part of putting together a complex, sort of multi-sounds product like this is that you want each data set to have its own voice and to be easily discernible. So you're conveying very specific information. And so every part of those sounds is sort of thought about and designed, right? The range of the pitches, the attack, we do a lot of sound design as part of this, and the Python code provides a nice flexible framework to do that.
Well, that's awesome. And I'd like to just add in there for people with hearing disabilities who may be interacting with this presentation is that I think that a lot of what you have here could be, we could be looking at haptics for this, and the visuals that go with this are really good. So there's a number of different avenues that I'd love to hear from people about in the future. All right, with that, I think we'll get a chance to switch interpreters. I'll reset my timer. And we're going to be getting ready for our next person, who is Phia. Okay.
My name is Phia Damsma, and I'm the co-founder and creative director of Sonokids Australia. And I also work in the field of special education here in Australia, New Zealand, and the South Pacific countries. I strongly believe in sonification as a technology that can open doors for students who are blind or have low vision to STEM education and STEM careers. And that's very relevant because in education, we come across a lot of students who drop out of STEM subjects because it's very visually orientated, and it's very hard for them to keep on that, whereas we feel they are very able to do it. It's just that the visual representation throws up barriers that even with current assistive technology sometimes cannot be conquered. With Sonokids, we developed a free app called Cosmoboli on Sonoplanet, and I've brought my little friend Cosmoboli, who's a round-shaped character, and she wears like a onesie, which is like a helmet and a spacesuit in one. So she's an astronaut, and the app is about a planet called Sonoplanet, where everything is sonified. And the main goal of developing this app was that we will hear more about other tools, and we've heard of the one from Leif, and these are very advanced, great sonification tools for people in STEM careers. But it made me think, like, how do you get there? Because we don't get training when we are really young in schools. Everything is focusing on show and tell and looking at graphs and learning about pie charts. But how could it work if we introduce children and young students to sonification from the start in education? That's what we were interested in. So we developed this app, and it is a game app, like all our SonoKids apps. So it's play and learn, and the app allows you to play 4 different games with sonifications in them. You can draw on the touch screen of an iPad or an Android touch tablet with your finger, and that is sonified. You can trace a sonified line and find different objects on the planet. You can try and find the aliens, or the salients as they're called, on Sonoplanet, and they're hiding, and you have to listen to sets of sonifications to find them in a grid. And we have a quiz which introduces the way that we have done the sonification, because you will find through this presentation that we all use different algorithms for the sonification based on the audience, based on the subject, based on the purpose of the sonification, I suppose. All sorts of different reasons that we can't touch on today. And for our purpose, obviously, because we had our user group in mind, young children, the sonification is very basic and has only a few different ways of letting you know what the information is about. And I think that, Shamsi, if you can play a little bit of my demo, maybe that will help.
A double tone indicates a point on a line. Moving horizontally, the pitch of the tone stays the same, but the further to the right, the higher the tempo is of the double tone. This is what a horizontal line sounds like sonified from left to right. When a horizontal line is sonified from right to left, the pitch stays the same again, but the tempo of the double tone goes down. This is a horizontal line which is sonified from right to left. Moving in a vertical direction, the tempo of the double tone stays the same, but the pitch changes. The higher a data point is located on the touchscreen, the higher the pitch of the tone is. So a vertical line, sonified from top to bottom, sounds like this. And the vertical line, sonified from bottom to top, sounds like this. If you put them together, you get a rectangle. We have used a bell sound alert to indicate a turn coming up. This is a rectangle, sonified starting in the top left corner and moving to the right.
Thank you. And we've done a survey, and there's research that I published in the British Journal of Visual Impairment that you can find, that it works. The children can actually use sonification from a very young age, from around 3 or 4 years, and then all the way up. And we just hope that people are starting to embrace this concept and introduce sonification in the classroom, in a mainstream classroom, because for all children, attentive listening to information in sound is very relevant for a lot of different subjects and a lot of different reasons. We hope that with this app as well, we contribute to greater access to information in education for students who are blind or have low vision, and encourage them to take on careers in STEM. so they can be on this panel in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Phia. That's fantastic. So we also enjoy having Phia present at just about any event that I do for Sonification, because she's representing that idea also that we have to remember to teach what we're asking people to interpret very well, because we don't have that background. People don't have Sonification background. And someday, if Phia keeps up the good work, we will. So now pause to switch interpreters. And Robin is up next.
Hi everyone, I'm Robin Williams. I'm a fully blind research statistician. I work to produce statistical models to predict the outcomes of sporting events. I have a PhD in applied statistics, and I'm from Exeter in southwest England in the UK. Today I'm going to talk about and briefly demonstrate the R package called Sonify, aptly, which was developed between myself and a colleague during my PhD who did most of the coding. It forms a part of my workflow on a regular basis. For example, common use cases that I make of the package are interpreting functions. So it could be something as simple as y equals x squared, or it could be something much more complicated. Interpreting unfamiliar probability distributions. So for example, I think most sighted people would go to Google Cauchy distribution, for example, and very quickly have a graphic of what the probability distribution function looks like. Not so easy if you can't see the graphics, so the Sonify package is a big help. And perhaps most importantly for myself is using the package to get an idea of the shape of two-dimensional scatter plot data. The introductory video on the website demonstrates the features of the package. It's too long to play in full here. I think it's about 25 minutes. So instead, we've decided to just play a short segment that demonstrates soundscaping or sonifying the normal distribution with a couple changes in parameters. So if we'd be able to play that segment now. So I'm now going to play a soundscape of those the normal density of those x values, the standard normal with mean 0, standard deviation 1, and I've added a tick mark at 0. So when I hear that, it becomes apparent that for those specified parameters, there isn't much or any real density at the left and rightmost parts of the plot, which is as we would expect. And then it kind of peaks quite sharply at 0 where I put the tick mark. So it's the classic bell curve. If I was to move the mean of this distribution to say 2, oh, I've got all capitals there for some reason. If I was to move the mean of this distribution to say 2, we will hear something different. So you can hear there that you've got more area on the left-hand side of the plot with with no density, and that the peak is no longer at 0. The peak's, of course, at 2, where the mean is. Okay, so that's just a very brief overview of one potential use case. So in the future, I'm very keen to develop the package further and to make it more useful to a broader range of people. The package code is now on GitHub, so please reach out to me on there. If you go to GitHub and search for rsonify, all one word, you can hopefully find it. As I say, I'm very keen for ideas. My ideas of how to extend the package currently include techniques to better visualize the full or more details of the distribution of scatterplot data. At the minute, you can get an idea of the rough shape, but it would be nice to know more about the variability, say, of the scatterplot at different regions of the plot. It would be nice to be able to identify and interpret the density of data at different points of a scatterplot. Sometimes a scatterplot can be misleading because you actually have very little data in a certain region. And potentially it would be nice to be able to zoom in more detail on a certain region of a plot and potentially be able to pause, rewind, fast forward the soundscape so you can get more detail of specific features that you're interested in. Those are just a few of my ideas and a very brief overview of the package. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks, Robin. I've got a couple seconds here, so I'm going to ask one of the questions that came up. As you describe where to find Sonify, but how would you, what would you recommend for someone who's just getting started with your package? Any recommendations?
Assuming they have some familiarity with R, basic familiarity, just to play around with some very simple functions. I will share the code that I use to produce that video. But essentially you can just make a vector of X values and then, for example, a second vector of Y values where you can put Y equals sine of X, for example, and you can then just run the Sonify function, Sonify X comma Y, and it will produce you a basic soundscape. The package is fully documented as well in the R help system, so that should provide a basic starting point.
Well, thanks a lot. And so we're going to pause again, and we're going to get started with Scott in just a second. Take it away, Scott.
All right, thanks everyone. And apologize, my voice is a little weird. I'm getting over a bout of either COVID or the flu, but I'm good enough to be here. My name's Scott Fleming. I'm an astrophysicist at the Space Telescope Science Institute, which is located in Baltimore, Maryland. My team operates a data archive of more than 4 petabytes of data from over 20 different missions, most of them NASA space telescopes, spanning the last 50 years. Active missions that we support include telescopes you probably heard of before, like the Hubble Space Telescope, JWST, and the TESS exoplanet hunting mission. 2 of the strategic goals of the Institute are to advance state-of-the-art astronomical archives and make the world's astronomical information accessible to all. So recent work along both of these lines, there are folks at the Institute who have been working hard on tactile representations of some of the beautiful images that you've seen in press releases and movies and all over the place from our telescopes. Since that was brought up earlier, and it is something that we're working on at the Institute. But for me and some of the folks I've been working with most closely, we've been exploring the use of sonification to represent the data that our telescopes collect in sound as a new way of exploring these data sets, in addition to increasing the accessibility of the data itself. So I lead a project called Astronify, which is an open source Python package that's designed to represent the astronomical data that we have as sound for research purposes. And what I mean by that is the same way that you would normally be able to interpret a chart or graph using your vision to understand what's happening, for example, with the stock markets on a given day. We want our sonifications to be able to be listened to and interpret what's happening with the data the same way. So there's a couple reasons why we're interested in using sonification, and accessibility is really just only one of them. Actually, there's a lot of use cases where including sound, either instead of or in addition to other means of interpreting data, really enhance your ability to explore those data sets. Real quickly, two of those examples is the human ear is actually way more sensitive to change than the eye. It's about 10,000 times better at identifying something changing by a change in pitch versus a change in screens. And then another great example of how sonification can be a powerful augmentation is in high dimensional data sets. It's easy to make a two-dimensional chart, X versus Y. We all learn how to do that in school. You can make three-dimensional charts and visualize them in animations, but making four-dimensional charts are beyond our human capabilities. But sound is inherently three-dimensional and has additional dimensions on top of it, pitch and timbre and choice of instrument and all the frequencies and everything else. And so it's inherently easier to explore complex data sets with sound with various degrees of training, ranging from essentially no training to really sophisticated training. So in order to do a quick little demo, I'm going to try and share my screen real quick, if that's okay. I'm going to share this window. Hopefully you all can see my slides, or a slide. But what I'm showing here on the plot is an example of what happens sometimes when a planet crosses in front of its star, which is this yellow circle at the top right. And what happens is if we happen to be looking at the right time, when a planet crosses in front of its host star, it will actually block a very small amount of light. And so if we're measuring the star's brightness very, very, very precisely, we can actually monitor when a planet goes in front of its star, and that's a way we can detect exoplanets and have been doing so successfully for quite some time. This is some real data of a single transit. You can see this like a classic U shape that starts off with some measurement of the star's intrinsic brightness, and then at some point something walks across the face of the star relative to our line of sight, blocks a small fraction of a percentage of the light, and we can see that dip visually, but we can also represent this as sound. So Samshi, if you don't mind sharing, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now for the context pictures. And if you could share the video, what I'm going to play for you is a very, very small clip of a representation of, in this case, 3 successive transits. And as you listen to the data, for those who can see the chart, you'll notice there's 3 individual transits or dips. There's also a sort of an overall long-term trend of the star itself changing slightly over time, its brightness. So let's go ahead and listen to the sonification version of this light curve. Star. So you can imagine how, in a similar way to how if someone with a little bit of context, either as much or a little bit more than what I just gave you very briefly here, you can look at that and say, there are 3 potential transits of this exoplanet. By looking at that chart very quickly, audio-wise, you can also do the same thing, which is the accessibility part. And then the sort of enhanced analysis part comes into details like what's happening to the sound itself. Is the shape asymmetrical or not? How deep is it? How wide is it? And does it change from transit to transit? These are all properties of the data that we can use sonification to enhance our analysis of these data sets. So for anyone who's interested in learning more about Astronify, it's pretty easy to Google search, but you can also look at the roughly 12-minute long video presentation that's at the forum's website, or a much longer, almost hour-long presentation I gave at an accessibility event at Space Telescope on YouTube, where I go into a lot more details.
Okay, thank you, Scott. That was great. And our last speaker is going to be Sarah. We'll pause for just a second while we switch interpreters. And now, Sarah, you may go.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Kane. I am a PhD student at the Institute of Astronomy at the University of Cambridge in England. Primarily what I study is Milky Way formation. I'm interested in how stars, particularly the chemicals that they're made of, can inform us about the history of the galaxy. But I also happen to be legally blind, which means I have fairly limited remaining vision. And that has given me what I consider to be a vested interest in sonification, which I consider to be particularly exciting because it has the potential to make astronomy and science in general, as many of the other speakers have mentioned, more inclusive for people with visual impairments or other disabilities. And so what I don't do is actually make sonification tools myself. But what I am interested in is how we can use existing sonifications or sonification tools to test the educational potential or even to provide educational resources in astronomy or in science in general. And so to that extent, one thing that I have done is worked with a programmer, Patrick Smith, to host a non-visual data science tutorial series. If you, in fact, Google non-visual data science workshop, it will, I think, come up. And so Scott conveniently just showed us Astronify, which is meant to sonify light curves, a measurement of how bright a star is as a function of time. But in fact, we can imagine that many types of data kind of behave like this, where you have some sort of value changing as a function of time. One example that comes to mind immediately is weather. Temperature will fluctuate with time, going up and down with the seasons in most places. And so in these non-visual data science tutorials, we taught participants using Astronify how to sonify temperature data, real temperature data of weather in global cities in a way that was inclusive and accessible, because there are a ton of data science tutorials, ours are in Python in particular, out there, but generally the way they teach participants to explore the data is with graphs and visualizations, which isn't super accessible if you can't see that graph or visualization. So we provided tutorials in sonification, again, particularly using Astronify as another way to explore your data and to learn the fundamentals of data analysis with programming. But even though those tutorials were particularly geared towards blind low vision participants, I've also done work with Kim Arcand and Jastasik and others looking at how sonifications, in this case of data from NASA telescopes, improves experience of that data for many people, not just for people who are blind or low vision. And so in the results of that study, where we played participants sonifications, again, of data from NASA telescopes, we found that participants, regardless of whether or not they were blind or low vision, reported enjoying and feeling like they learned from the sonifications. And this is, again, as many other participants have touched on, I think Scott in particular, is indicative of the potential of sonification, not only as an accessibility tool, but simply as a really valuable tool for many, many people. This is sort of my favorite soapbox to stand on, the soapbox of universal design, which is this idea that when you make something accessible for people with disabilities, you just make it better for everyone. And I think sonification is a really great example of that in action. But we do find, even in our work, in that work with the NASA sonifications, we find that blind low vision folks do report being even more motivated to learn about the universe and about how people access information about the universe after hearing the sonifications. And we interpreted this as meaning that these astronomy sonifications were making these outreach, these education materials accessible and inclusive to this community that has, frankly, historically and traditionally been excluded from astronomy because there's such a strong reliance on quote unquote pretty pictures, so to speak. And this is something, again, that Phia touched on, this idea that sonification has the potential to bring more people into STEM, into science, in a way that visualizations can sometimes make people feel excluded. And so that is, broadly speaking, my spiel. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks, Sarah. I've got a little bit of time left, but on yours, so I'm going to jump into, some questions that were online, which were around, what is your perspective about tools and inclusivity? If you had anything else to say about, that as far as your own research goes.
Yeah, so as far as my own research goes, this is certainly astronomy these days is I would say something of a mixed bag. I won't say that there aren't still barriers, but things are, I think, getting better and there's more awareness. I would say with regards to sonification itself, the honest answer is that I don't tend to use sonification actively in my other research, and that I do tend to use my remaining vision rather a lot. Is probably the most honest answer there.
No, that's really great, and I appreciate your input here. And what we're going to do next for our time here is we're going to take some questions, and I'm going to start with some of the ones that have come across in the Q&A. And if any of the panelists would like to jump in, you have a choice. If you can find the raise your hand button, please go ahead and do that. If you'd like to jump in, I just ask that you just say your name first so that we all know who's doing the talking. So I am going to go over here, and I was looking at some of the questions that came in. And first of all, let's just review some of the tools, because the questions are coming up about what tools are being used to develop sonifications, and we've already hit a few of them. We've got Python codes, Astronify, Sonify R. Are there others that that panelists would like to bring to our attention?
Hi, it's Robin. I'm aware that there are other libraries out there, particularly written in Python. I'm not overly familiar with them, but it's something I need to look at more. There's also the SAS Graphics Accelerator, which is a Chrome extension, which is pretty cool. You can import CSV files, for example, and have them sonified kind of similarly to what we can do with the R package. But it's nice that it's built into Chrome. So yeah, there are more things out there than maybe we think. It's just they're quite disparate. They're not very joined up.
Leif.
Yeah, I just saw a couple of questions about the Python code that we used. And I guess short answer is it's on GitHub. It's actually the best version of it, sort of the most shareable version is on my collaborator Ben Holtzman at Columbia's GitHub site, and I'm going to type it into the chat, his GitHub repository as an example. There's a bunch of Python Jupyter notebooks that implement a lot of the things, not all the things, but a lot of the things that I show in that video.
Okay, go ahead and put that in the agenda document, the panel structure shared doc, if you can. That would be helpful. Anybody else? Because I've got a couple more along these lines. Oh, go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, just a couple of tools in particular that come to mind. Robin, as you mentioned, there are other Python packages out there. The one that comes to mind in particular is Strauss. I believe that is Strauss. Which is another Python package intended for sonification that I recommend checking out. I also, though I'm not personally super familiar with it, I think another web-based interface for sonification is HighChart Sonification Studio. So that's another option to check out if maybe Python isn't your thing.
Yes, and following up on what Sarah just said with the HighCharts, Georgia Tech has the Sonification Studio, and they archive all of the International Community for Auditory Display, ICAD, proceedings, and that's a very good resource. And HighCharts is also something you can plug in your own data to. So that is another excellent one. And I know that Dan Green from Harvard also wanted to make us aware of his work in that area, and that will also be on the resources documentation. Any others we want to highlight? Scott, it looked like you might have had something to say.
I was debating. I mean, I think some of there are a lot of packages, and this also touches on another really good question I saw about why do we all make our own, which we can get to later if you want, Kate. But at least within astronomy, Python is the dominant language of choice. It's relatively easy to learn. It doesn't need to be compiled, and it's fairly easy to make packages that are shareable and installable. But I do know of other astronomy software packages written in Java or C, for example. Those tend to be more browser-based. A lot of astronomy workflows tend to be scripted and rely on basically being able to have something that you can mix in with your workflows, and those workflows are often in Python by themselves. So there's another sort of good reason why, at least in astronomy, a lot of people are choosing to write sonification tools in Python, so that there's at least the option to include it alongside your other Python code that's doing other analysis packages.
Okay, and along those lines, there was a question for Robin. Can you make a device for Gplot which outputs sonic instead of graphics? Hope you can interpret that question, because I can't.
Sorry, can you ask that again?
It says, can you make a device for Gplot which outputs sound or sonics instead of graphics?
It's not something I know much about, but my hunch is, with some effort, yes. Potentially so. I think, does it use SVG graphics, Gplot, in which case it feels like that might be possible. So yeah, that would be really cool if we could have sonification kind of as an option to some commonly used R packages such as Gplot. So instead of specifying a graphical plot, you just get a soundscape out at the end of it. That's the kind of utopia, I suppose. Yeah, it's a good food for thought.
Yeah, and along those lines, somebody else is asking about the use of Sonify and Braille art to be used together somehow. So do you have anything you could add to that?
Yes, I do that very thing. Do use of Braille art, and which is good at, for example, giving you information around histograms, and some more kind of descriptive statistics of scatter plots and so on, and combining that with Sonify is helpful for me. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. I think that there's questions along these lines about producing sonifications. We're asking about resolution and how does this compare with the information get out visually or tactily. I think this also gets us into this area that we've discussed before about the need for evaluations. but does anyone on the panel have some things to say about any research or anything they know about conveying information or how it compares with the information you get from visuals or tactiles? Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, so I don't know the exact specifics, but I can give a couple of examples that I'm aware of. First of all, in terms of like the sensitivity of sonification versus vision, I'm not going to touch on tactics or haptics because I'm not really a tactile expert. But the thing I always like to tell people in my presentations is, you know, if you're a video game enthusiast or you're buying TVs, you will never find 1,000 FPS frame per second monitor. And there's a couple reasons for that. There might be technical challenges, but the simplest reason is that the human eye is just not that sensitive to change that fast. And so all these manufacturers don't need to worry about making 1,000 or million FPS televisions. They can get by with 120 just fine because the human eye is basically sensitive to about 1 part in 100 when it comes to change. The human ear is capable of picking up changes in 1 part in a million. So it can distinguish frequencies at the hertz level at that level of change. And so that's about a 10,000 time difference when it comes to just general sensitivity between vision and sonification. And one of the reasons why a lot of us are exploring it to augment interpretation of data, especially when you're looking for signals or features that change over time. In terms of some of the questions about testing it, that's actually, at least within the field of astrophysics, been a key driver for a couple of teams. And in fact, Sarah, you've been involved in some of those, so I'll let you talk to your own work on that front. But there are several teams who are writing peer-reviewed publications that are taking real astrophysical questions or interpretations and comparing visual only, sonified only, and mixtures. And it's still early days and small number of statistics, but one of the repeatable findings is that without any of the same basic training you've received in your college or high school careers about interpreting visual plots, the participants sit down, almost all of them have found out about sonification as a thing for the first time, and within the session itself are able to do basically as good as the visual comparison. So it's just sort of emphasizing that use of sonification is very intuitive, and with even a little bit of training can really put you very far. But Sarah, did you have anything else you want to talk about, some of the work you've done recently on that front?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting point, and as you've brought up, a very active sort of field of research. The work I've done with those Universe of Sound, those NASA sonifications, didn't deal so much with these sort of details that people could pick up, but more about how people sort of perceived their learning. So this sort of self-reported learning, which is still a valuable indicator. Certainly, especially given that these sonifications and the accompanying visualizations were meant for outreach purposes. We certainly want people to feel like they learned and enjoyed from these sonifications. And as you mentioned, many of these people probably had never heard a sonification before, had never heard of a sonification before, and still reported feeling like they had learned from them, feeling like they enjoyed them, feeling that they had really extracted meaning from these sonifications in, you know, a very short interaction via an online survey with these sonifications, which I really think speaks to the power of sonification. But if I can speak a little bit more anecdotally, in fact, about back when I sort of first jumped into sonification, which was via user testing for Astronify, I think one of the things your team did really well, among many things you did well, was including user testing to make sure that these details in the shapes of exoplanet transits could be heard in the sounds, that, you know, how sharply the light dipped from the star could be detected. I think that was, you know, really important to the functionality of Astronify and worked really well. And as you mentioned, I knew what a light curve was. I knew how exoplanet transits worked because I was at that time an undergrad in astronomy. And without, at that point, ever having used a sonification, intuitively, Astronify made sense just from that background knowledge of how exoplanet transits worked. and then hearing the sonification and user testing, it clicked. So I think, as you mentioned, there's a lot of more really interesting work to be done here, but a lot of promise as well.
Okay, well, thank you, Sarah and team. And I want to make sure that we get a chance when we come back. If you have anything else to add to this particular topic, we'll open with that. But at this point, I do want to take our break. We're going to take an 8-minute break and come back and be ready for questions, discussions around the perspectives from astronomy and geosciences before we move on to other sections. So give us a 8-minute break. Thanks, everyone. All right, I see our interpreter is ready to go. And I want to start this second half. Thanks everyone for sticking around. First of all, are there any of our panelists who have something they're burning to say, thoughts they want to follow up from the first half? Oh, Phia, go ahead.
Sorry, can I yeah, I saw some questions in the chat, but maybe, or in the Q&A, or do we respond to that later?
We're going to get to most of them, but if there's one that
Okay.
seems that we might have missed, please feel free right now.
Well, I think it's an interesting question. It's about the advantages of sonification over tactile representations.
Yeah,
and I think
try
it's
and hit
very
that.
relevant. It's a relevant question. And I think from my perspective in education, the big advantage is that if you have a sonification tool, you have immediate access to the data without anybody else doing something to the data to prepare them for you. There can be raw data that are sonified, and as a researcher, you have access to them. Whereas with tactile things, especially in education, there are alternate format producers who produce the representation as a tactile graph, for instance. And that takes time, and they have their own vision on how it should be represented, like a tactile image. Whereas if you can have multimodal access, I don't think we have mentioned it before now, but we all agree, I think, in the Sonification World Chat, having access to different modes at the same time is the best way to go. Like sonification, as well as having access to a visual representation, if you have any vision, as well as tactiles, as well as haptics, and everybody can get the most of out of the things that suit them best, and all together they sort of increase the working of all these different things together. So I'll leave it at that because we've got to talk about.
Robin, go ahead, and then Scott.
Sorry, yeah, just to add to that, I think in terms of tactile representations, the landscape is changing quite rapidly at the moment. So Thea is obviously right that historically you would have had to have, in education, you would have had to have had a graphic prepared for you. There are now these refreshable tactile devices coming on the market. So there's the Monarch kind of tactile display, there's the Graffiti from Orbit Research. So these are devices that are going to enable you to generate tactile representations of images in real time, albeit that they might be a bit rough and ready. So I think, as Thea says, having access to different modalities is going to be important, but equally there will be some applications where tactile representations make more sense and others where sonifications make more sense. For example, if you're just interested in a box plot, there's no real need to sonify that if you can get that in a tactile form straight away. Whereas, as Scott said earlier, if you've got multi-dimensional data, you're much more likely, in my opinion, to be able to learn from that through a sonification rather than what you would have to do with a tactile device, which would be to zoom into various kind of two-dimensional cross sections. So yeah, having access to everything is good.
Scott, did you have a follow-up for that?
Well, Robin actually hit on one of my points already. Good job, Robin. No, I just wanted to emphasize that haptics and tactiles are super important and have roles to play, and there's definitely pros to them. But just to highlight two of the cons, one of them again is that you're limited to 3 dimensions or slices within, which can complicate analyzing really complex dimensions of data. And the other one is that often haptics are fairly expensive, even today, especially if you want to distribute it to lots of students or people. Whereas devices these days often have stereo speakers built in that are perfectly acceptable already to use, or getting stereo headphones is much cheaper than getting a good haptics device in most cases. So there's also a cost factor that Sonification has as a pro to it.
Oh yeah, these new tactile devices are super expensive. You're talking somewhere around anywhere between kind of $15,000 to $25,000 US at the minute. Hopefully that will come down in time, but that's obviously way out of the reach of lots of people, particularly in certain parts of the world. So
Excellent, excellent. So we've got some good thoughts on that, and I see some things coming in on our shared document about communities and other places where we can get information. So I'm even learning some new things today about who's doing good work out there, and thanks everyone for sharing. The next thing I want to spend a little time exploring is from the perspective of astronomy and the geosciences that are represented on this panel. What are some thoughts that you guys have about your work? And I'm thinking in terms of funding, putting teams together. We have some enthusiastic librarians in our document that would love to look at partnerships with libraries. So let's take a few minutes to explore that area. Anyone like to start us off? Oh, go ahead, Sarah.
Sorry, this is something I suppose I'm a little very eager to speak about. I suppose in the realm of astronomy in particular, which is what I'm more familiar with, both in outreach and also in research, but I'll focus on outreach in this case in particular, and why I think sonification is really well suited to astronomy. One of, I think, the most common misconceptions we get with sonifications, for instance, in that study I mentioned, but I think also generally, and maybe many of the panelists here can relate to this, is, wow, this is literally what space sounds like. Like, this is incredible. And that's not, we're not putting a microphone up to space. This is some representation of the data. And so this is actually just parallel to other misconceptions about data representations in astronomy. So I'm sure many people have seen like these beautiful pictures from space telescopes where they're like beautiful colors and they inspire this sense of awe. But those aren't actually pictures for the most part, because most telescopes don't look at light that any human eye can see. These are visualizations, visual representations of data, and they are inherent to astronomy. Most of what we, quote unquote, look at in astronomy was never visible to the human eye in the first place. And so that, I think, makes it especially sensible to have sonifications in astronomy. And I think that's something we could really lean on in outreach and education, this sort of natural propensity for astronomy to be well suited to sound representations, because in many ways it's all invisible to us in the first place. I don't have any experience working with librarians or in particular, but I certainly would be eager to. So do reach out, I suppose.
Okay, we'll find ways for us to do that. Who would like to address this next? I see lots of nodding going on. Leif, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I can just sort of say from experience a little bit, like there's a sort of honeymoon period when one discovers sonification, particularly if you come at it late, where everything seems very exciting that you can represent it in a novel way. And what I've found is that one of the challenges is that one needs to sort of take each case and consider it separately, and that's a bit at odds with the popular tools I think that are put out there, right, which give you a few different sonification choices and allow you to take whatever say, CSV file or data you might have and listen to it. It's great, right? But once you make a few of those, you realize that they all sort of sound the same. And so you need to think about what it is that you want to do. I'll chalk that up to the field being rather young in some sense, right? So no doubt this will get solved, but it's something to consider as you're thinking about sonifying data, that we have a huge palette, only a tiny fraction of which is currently being used.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Jump in real quick as well. So I just want to clarify that data sonification itself is really not a new field. It's actually its own academic field. It's been going on for 40 or 50 years probably, and is quite healthy from an academic perspective. But what is new, and what I think Leif was really referring to, is the application of data sonification within other areas of STEM for sort of day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year research purposes, like to use that as an actual professional. And that is very much new. And Leif can definitely comment on the geoscience side of things, but I suspect it's similar. There's been a lot of really exciting progress, as you've seen and heard about today, from not just us, but other teams as well in the world working on this. But they've been doing it with small grants or on the side or small teams of 1 to 5 people. And we've made a lot of progress and a lot of tools. We've learned a lot. But at this point in time, to take that next big step really requires a serious investment, multi-million-dollar grant to really take what we've learned over the last 15 or 20 years of work here and have it sort of be front and center when it comes to higher education of STEM fields. Libraries certainly have a role to play there, and making it sort of day-to-day factor within the various STEM disciplines, right? So that's where we're missing, and where I think, since funding was brought up, it could be a real partnership there. I mean, we've been trying to do that, but I think it's tough within our own STEM disciplines and our own standard funding agencies, funding resources, which typically are funding more pure research grants than this. So there might be really interesting partnerships with things like libraries to come together to really invest significantly, not as side projects or prototypes that we've been doing over this time, but really take those prototypes and say, we're going to work together to make this part of standard curricula, to make it part of every library's education research department resources, and to make it show up at geoscience, oceanography, you name it, standard like archives and publications. I think we're basically at that point ready to dive into that area, but it's not going to be done with small grants here and there. It has to be done with a really cohesive investment there. And Sarah, I know you have something you want to comment on.
Sorry to keep.
I'm going to have you make it brief because I'm going to flip over to a different topic.
Sorry, I just wanted to comment briefly with a very I just an anecdote that I fell into sonification completely by accident because I stumbled across Astronify looking for Scott's email. And so it makes me wonder how many other blind low vision students there are out there that, as Scott and Leif and many others here have mentioned, we could be reaching right now that we aren't, because again, it's a very sort of disparate process. So yeah, I definitely think we're at the point where consolidation is the ideal to both bring together our research efforts so that the tools are cohesive, and also to reach people who we don't even know who are out there who might make use of this.
Thank you. And I will close this particular topic by saying that, at least from my perspective, I know that the National Science Foundation is interested in receiving projects that are focused on the creation of sonifications. And that if you want to make sure you get in touch with me, with the Sonification World Chat, and a new project that's starting this month called GeoSonnet, which is going to be specifically looking at promoting applications to the NSF for in the geosciences, and it could be partnered with libraries. then just, keep me in mind. And with that, I'm going to pivot us over. I can't decide. I think I'm going to flip my questions here and jump down to what does full participation look like? Because Scott, started to note this. And do I have my interpreter good? I'm good. I'll let you switch. All right. So in terms of, let's imagine, what does full participation look like with the support of sonification? Let's dream for a moment about what could it do for disability access in STEM or big data management for STEM.
Sorry.
Robin, do you want to start? Go ahead.
I think that Sarah made an important point just then with how many people are not aware of this field and therefore unable to access this kind of way of accessing data. And I know from my personal experience that it certainly helped me. And I'd go as far as to say it enabled me to complete my PhD earlier than I may otherwise have done. And it allows me to keep up at times with my sighted peers at work. So I think combined with other modalities that we talked about is a very important field. And Scott's right that it is worthy of proper, in quotes, further research.
And thank you, Robin. Scott.
Yeah, so I definitely want others to chime in, but one of the things you asked, like, what does it look like in this future that we can dream about? And what I always like to think about is most people on this call, I hope, have, are probably coming from areas where they often have to listen to presentations, right? Whether it's a conference or a meeting at work or whatever. And especially in the sciences, that's fundamental to being a scientist. And so my vision is that every single time someone throws up a slide and says, as you can see, shows plot or picture or map of the ocean or the volcano 2D data or whatever, a sound is played as well. And we have a long way to go there. But the way I like to tell people about it is, imagine, I don't have this lived experience, but imagine you're trying to, next time you're at one of these meetings or a conference talk or whatever it is you do in your own day-to-day, imagine trying to sit through the entire thing with your eyes closed and ask, did you actually get what they were showing? And the answer is going to be no, I promise you, first of all. And second of all, I think better education on what it means to give good universal design, best practice presentations, things like describing what you're showing rather than just saying, as you can see, minimizing text, contrast choices, all those things, as well as having sonified representations of data will make any field that much more accessible. And it's not just, blind low vision either, right? It's English as second language, different neurodiversities, learning preferences. All of these things are made better if, as different STEM fields, people get better at giving more accessible presentations.
And for those of you who can't see, we've got a lot of heart emojis and cheering going on the screen. So we're getting a lot of good feedback from the audience on those comments. Phia, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, well, from my perspective, I dream of all students at school from kindy, from what we call here kindy in Australia, kindergarten, learning about sonification, or that being at the core of everything, just like you learn to look at pictures, and that it's becoming the new normal. And I think already we've seen a huge shift in some things that were originally assistive technology type things like audio description, videos that are being audio described. I mean, people use their iPhones and sneak it under the desk at the office and read what the transcript is of a video. So that has become a ubiquitous thing, whereas it also supports a person who can't actually see the images or hear the thing. You can read along. For the deaf community, that is very important, obviously. So I'm hoping that sonification also gets adopted widely in all areas. And particularly, I think, it's important to educate our students in learning the skills to be able to interpret, because I admire everybody, who says it comes intuitive and you can hear all these things. But honestly, some of the higher end tools, I struggle to hear all these different dimensions, whereas others, you can hear this, and this is the pitch and the timbre. And sometimes I think, one of our colleagues in the World Chat talks about 10 different dimensions on top of each other, and you can hear all these different characteristics of the data. I cannot hear them. But I haven't been trained in attentive listening from when I was 3-4 years old. And I feel that if we do train people and it becomes the new normal in the classroom, it will enhance learning, and it can give a different perspective on a lot of data that we might not even be aware of now. How we always interpret things in general by looking at them. Who knows what we can discover if all these people start listening to the information that is all around us. That would be very interesting.
Okay, thank you, Phia. And I'm going to add one thing from before we go to Leif, and it's that I know we have talked in Sonification World Chat also about what if publications had, along with the graphic, you could access a sound file that would be a clear representation of the data, and how to do that, exploring how to do that. That's a grant in and of itself. So Leif, you had something else you would like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I guess from the standpoint of learning something new from the research standpoint, I think a real power of sonification could be for machine learning and defining features, particularly for time series data. Oftentimes we're, after very subtle patterns or things that covary, and that's quite hard to detect visually, certainly, and even with your standard off-the-shelf signal processing and sonification hearing, as Scott mentioned, we're sort of wired to hear patterns in noisy data, aren't we? So it's a really powerful tool that I think is underutilized.
All right, Phia, I'm real quick, but that because I want to see if we can hit one more question.
Okay, no, sorry, I just wanted to add that we did have a paper published in Nature Astronomy, where we did have sonification of all the graphs that were in the paper. So they were the first to actually adopt that. Yeah.
That's right. Thank you very much for bringing that up. That also brings us to the final topic that I want to try and squeeze in our last couple of minutes here, is the necessity and importance of having a multidisciplinary team. So looking at people from music, the data itself, the cultural aspects of sound and the parts of sound. How do we process sound, neural processing, all of those. Can you guys speak to that topic before we depart? And Scott, you're nodding. Would you like to start?
Yeah, I feel like I'm dominating too much as usual, the discussion, but no, we've thought about it, and we actually had a really good conference in Europe 2 years ago or so. And, Astronify, you may notice, uses tones, doesn't use instruments or anything like that. And that was very much a conscious choice, because you might have subconscious bias about, I really like the violin, I'm not a fan of the trumpet. And so if you sonify data using trumpets or violins or even sounds in nature, you might bias your interpretation of the data in one way or the other, or have different sensitivities, whereas tones we figured were more neutral. Even basic questions like the use of the Western scale, which we're all familiar with musically, but is only one of many different interpretations of how to even make music that's pleasing to the ear. So there's a lot of really interesting design choices and considerations. And that's why ideally these teams include sound design experts, music experts, obviously statistics and the STEM area of interest, and programmers as well. It's super important to avoid those kinds of pitfalls.
See more nodding going on. Phia, go ahead.
Oh, right. Yeah, sorry. Okay. And I think I totally agree. We all know that this is so important to have all these different people involved, but I think we also agree that we need to have, if we are developing and designing for accessibility, then we need to involve the people who are best qualified to judge whether it's accessible or not right from the very start in the design process, not just as testers after the fact. But we have found the most success within in our teams where we include, for instance, in our case, we include students who are blind or have low vision and adult users of technology who are blind or have low vision in the development and the prototyping. And then we go back to the drawing board because they tell us it's no good and the interface needs to be accessible and usable. And you have to have those people involved in your team. Not just as a sort of end user, the goal that you're going, but as an active part of your team and very qualified and expert people. Yeah.
Lots of agreement going on and some more hearts popping up on our screen. And I would say with that also to that expert, that lived experience in interpreting your environment through sound, it can come at in any place in the team. It can come as your musical expert, your coder, your data scientist. It can come anywhere, but that's the component that's going to ensure that whatever tools you develop to manipulate that sonification are accessible, and having that person embedded is important. And so with that, I see Shamsi coming up to let us know our time is up. And I want to thank everyone for being here, especially arXiv for making this possible. This was well organized. I enjoyed this very much and hope to continue the conversations through Sonification World Chat, through the Decibel group that has got information in the document, and through follow-ups. So thank you very much. Bye.
And I will just add a quick thank you on behalf of arXiv to all the panelists and to all the attendees and interpreters and all the volunteers working in the background. And like Kate, I enjoyed this so much. Thank you so much.